Um, I am going to do I still haven't figured out what's going on with the share screen. It still won't let me, but I'm going to look into it again. But I'm going to start us off on page 33. So it's the very first page, chapter 2. It is necessary that there be either one original being or more than one. And if one, either motionless, as Parmenides and Melissus say, or in motion, as the writers about nature say, some claiming that air is the first source, other that it is water. But if there are more than one, they are either finite or infinite. And if finite, but more than one, either 2 or 3 or 4, or some other number. Or if infinite, either in such a way as Democritus says, one in kind, but unlimited in shape, or differing in kind and even opposite. And they make a similar inquiry who inquire how many beings there are. For of those first things out of which beings are constituted, they inquire whether they are one or many, finite or infinite. Sorry, they are inquiring whether the original and elementary being is one or many. Now to consider whether being is one and motionless is not to be examined in nature. For just as it no longer belongs to the geometer to give an account to someone who rejects his starting points, but either to a different science or to one common to all knowledge, so is it with the one considering origins. For it is not any longer an origin if it is one only, and there is therefore only one thing, for the origin is of something or some things. So to consider whether there is thus one thing is like discussing any other thesis whatever of people who argue for the sake of argument, such as the Heraclitan thesis, or if someone should say that being is one man, or like resolving a debater's argument, which is exactly what both the arguments are, those namely of Melissus and Parmenides. For they take up things that are false, and their accounts are illogically put together. Okay, I know that was a big section.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious about many things. Firstly, I'm curious about this section in the second paragraph I read where it says, now to consider whether being is one and motionless is not to be examining nature. And my kind of question is that Aristotle seems to be using being in a different way. I'm not really clear how he's using it right now. Is he using it to talk about, like he said, the elementary being, the original being? Is he using it to talk about beings that are in the world? Because he says here, taking the tack of if being is one and motionless, you cannot examine it in nature. So, and then later on he says, if it's an origin, it has to be of something. So I'm really kind of curious about what people are making his understanding of being to be. And feel free to take us somewhere else in the text to say, oh, this is a clear place. But, there are many other places that I can bring us to where I felt like he was talking about being as qualities as well. And I was really unsure as how he was using that word. So let's go with Brent first, and then we'll go to Peter.
Okay, I think that here is, first of all, he says that if there is only one thing, if there is only one being, then there is no origin, because, and that is that is an argument made by Parmenides, that being has always been and always will be and always is, and that didn't come out of anything because being has always been, and that if it did come out of something, the only thing it could come out of is something other than being, which is nothing. And nothing cannot be, so consequently, being does not have an origin. At the same time, Aristotle here is sort of like playing with the dichotomy between Parmenides and Heraclitus. Heraclitus said that there are many things. There is a great many things. And whereas, if we examine nature, nature has many things in it. And consequently, if we are only concentrating on that, saying that being is one, then we are not studying nature. We are studying something else, something metaphysical, perhaps something transcendental, but we are not studying nature. And in addition to that, Aristotle is noted for saying several times, particularly in the metaphysics and not so much in the physics, that being can be said in many ways. And that also is a confrontation with Parmenides. Parmenides never said that being can be said in many ways, but Aristotle does. It can be said in many ways. There are many ways of saying beings as there are beings in the world. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Brent. Okay, let's go to Peter. Peter?
Yeah, I think so that in that first sentence, now to consider whether being is one and motionless is not to be examining nature. I think, well, then I think again, like I think Brent alluded to, that's basically what he studies in the metaphysics. What is being? And nature, he says later on here that nature is basically going to be something that has a nature is something that has a principle of motion and rest internal to it. And so something that's motionless is sort of like not really in nature, in a sense.
Yeah,
I
thank you. Yeah, go for it. Joseph.
Okay, so I'm just walking in off the street, just taking a quick shot. But I mean, essentially, the way I'm looking at this is the idea that there's a cause for certain things, and that there's no cause for something that's motionless, and essentially that is like kind of there's no purpose behind it. And so I know this is kind of covered more in metaphysics than it is in the physics itself, but that that this is essentially just a more of a something that just happened by accidental chance, as opposed to having a purposeful chance and a pattern to it almost as well. So those are just some quick thoughts.
Thank you, Joseph. Greg?
Yep. Everything that everybody else said. And also, this seems to be part of his argument that there has to be at least two things, and this from like the sentence after. An origin is always an origin of something. And so if the origin is one, then it's not an origin of anything. So by definition, it's not an origin. You have to have an origin, and it's an origin of some second thing. It's like some point later, he says there has to be at least two things, and then he bumps it up to three. But for that reason, the origin is one thing, and what it's an origin of is a second thing.
Okay, so then, I mean, going to the next page where he says, but if all beings is bottom of 35, but if all beings are one in meaning, like a robe and a cloak, they turn out to be asserting the Heraclitean account. For being good and being bad would be the same thing, and being good and being not good. So that what is good and what is not good would be the same thing as would a human being and a horse, and their account would not be about the being one of all things, but about the being nothing of all things. Even being such and such a kind and being so much in size would be the same. So this is kind of what I was talking about at the tail end of my comment, because he says earlier up that for if it were to be both an independent thing, and I mean, he seems to be like trying to get rid of the idea that being is one. But where do these qualities come in with being good and being bad? That part I didn't really understand that in that section. And I will have to find it, but I think there are other places where he seems to be talking about beings as qualities of some sort, and being good and being bad, and this independent thing. I think is what Greg was talking about, where, you know, it can't be one because then it would need to have an origin, like something that originated it. And an independent thing kind of sounds like a thing in itself or something magical like that. Peter.
Well, here I think he's not putting forth his own doctrine or something, but he's arguing against people like Parmenides think there's only one thing, which means that basically it takes away the possibility of actually having any meaning. Because if there is no distinction, then one word is as good as another. I mean, you saw this in, I mean, Plato talks about that in the Protagoras, and you know, against Protagoras and with Theaetetus and everything. But you need to have distinctions. There can't, if everything is just one, you can't have distinctions, and all inquiry sort of stops, is what I think that point is. So it's not really a doctrine he's putting forward.
Thank you, Peter. Brent?
Yeah, I think that when he uses good and not good here, or being good and not being good, he is not actually talking about morality. He's not bringing up the subject of morality here. He is just talking about two characterizations, two adjectives. He's working his way into, at least I think at this stage of the chapter or of the book, to talk about the independent things. And you're quite right to equate independent things with sort of like with Kant's thing in itself, because he's actually working his way toward talking about, the Greek word is ousia, which has been translated in Latin as substance or substantia, and into English as substance. Those are both bad translations, by the way. But anyway, the original Greek word is ousia, and it is something that is. It is, you know, the aspect of something that when you hold something in your hand, you're talking about a particular thing that has a thisness to it. It exists, it is there in your hand. It is an independent being. But he wants to contrast ousia, or substance, with adjectives, like all the different categories, like quantity, quality, being good, being bad, being red, being heavy, being light, and all that stuff. Though it's very important in this chapter that we do not confuse or mix up adjectives with nouns. And Aristotle is talking about the noun as an independent thing, whereas adjectives, however, are sort of like forms. An independent thing, like a steel ball, can be black or it can be white, it can be heavy or it can be light, it can be round or it can be square, you know, any number of those things. Those are forms, and the forms are manifold, like all of the different categories. Like Aristotle said, being can be said in many ways. But when he is talking about being, he is talking about ousia, substance. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Brent. Allison?
One thing I was really struck by was how much of Newton's laws were I really taken from Aristotle, because I feel like this whole thing of being, how can something be without something out, that you have to have two things in order for something to be? That's essentially Newton's first law, the law of inertia, because an object at rest stays at rest unless acted upon. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon. And that's essentially what this is right here, because you can't have one thing without having something else. But then that sort of ties into, you know, the whole meaning of life and how did we get here? And, you know, it's a really interesting place to start. And it's very interesting that they both, you know, that Newton sort of gets all the credit for it. But I was really reading this. I was like, he gets all the credit, but he took so much of it from Aristotle. He may have taken it a step further, but really it's, the foundation was all right here in this book. That was very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Allison. Greg?
There's something that I don't know what to make of it, but it seems really significant. The word meaning, but at the beginning of that statement, but if all beings are one in meaning, like robe and cloak.
Yeah,
So talking about synonyms, and where's Peter? Oh,
yeah.
I don't remember the categories. Do you remember the categories? Because he's got some or is this going back to that? But his example, the word meaning in the example robe and cloak, I don't know how to apply it to what he says about good and bad, but it seems really significant.
Yeah, no, that was initially the kind of question mark that I had there, what he was talking about with robe and cloak. Peter, I'm glad you raised your hand. I don't look at the chat very often, but I saw you had a section that you were suggesting we look at. Is that what you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, but I think it's going back to Greg's question, about the meaning of the robe and cloak. If you're under Parmenides saying there's only one meaning, Parmenides only had one meaning for being. And non-being was just incomprehensible and was just, you just can't even speak it really. It's just nonsense to say non-being. But Aristotle's going to say being was said in many ways. But if there's only one meaning for things, then robe and cloak have no distinction, So that's a bad thing. But in the middle of page 34, I just want to say, he says, but for us, i.e., this is Aristotle's position, I believe, let it be assumed that the things that are by nature, either all or some of them, are in motion, which is obvious from the examples. So things that are natural things are things that are in motion. And so this Parmenides and Melissus are not going to have a good account for things because they can't account for motion, basically. They think it's all an illusion. And so when we get further, like chapter 7, 8, when he gets into the contraries and the lack and all that kind of stuff, then he's going to actually have a theory of how you can have motion, because being is said in different ways. And so there won't be a contradiction if you would think there's only one meaning of being. But being can have different things, and that's what he gets at. That's really what he studies in the metaphysics, I guess.
Thank you, Peter. Mike.
I think he's trying to contrast that there's unity, everything is one and everything is related, but you need to keep in mind that everything is different. He goes on to say that the one human being, one horse, or one soul represents differentiation. So you need to tie unity and differentiation together, and he's trying to go on to do that as we go further in this section.
Thank you, Mike. Nick. You're already unmuted, Nick.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm muted. Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to add to what Peter was saying, because I read the same thing, and the only thing ambiguous about it was that the way he used by nature, everything by nature, so forth, almost like by nature. But he does mean nature, because another translation of the same thing says, it must be granted by us that either all or some natural things are moving. This is clear from induction. So it isn't just by nature, it is about nature. Nature is moving. Okay. Just a little clarification.
Thank you, Nick. James.
Yeah, I just wanted to, on what Greg asked, that the cloak and the cloak, the robe and cloak are he just means them as examples of synonyms. So if everything is like the same, then being good and being bad could be the same thing. And not so good, not so bad, doesn't even matter, because everything's the same thing after all. So that's all. He's just pointing out the absurd case.
Okay.
Of all things being one thing.
Yeah. This is good. I like this for the first couple chapters. So I want to take us to 37. It must be understood first about all beings, this is at the top, that none either acts by nature at random, or is acted upon by any random thing. Nor does anything at all come into being by chance, from any chance thing, unless unless one takes what happens incidentally. For how could white come into being from something educated if the educated were not incidental to something non-white or black? Rather, white comes into being from what is not white, and not from every non-white thing, but from the black or what is in between, and educated from what is not educated, though not from every such thing, but from the uneducated, or from something between the two, if there is any. Nor is a thing transformed by destruction into the first chance thing, of the white, say, into the educated, except when it happens incidentally, but the white is transformed by destruction into the non-white, and not into a random non-white thing, but into something black or in between. And in the same way, the educated is transformed by destruction into the not educated, and not into a random one, but into the uneducated, or something between the two, if there's any. Okay. I'm really curious about a few things here. The in-between that comes up and the randomness that he is talking about. So yeah, if anyone's got comments on those two things, the in-between seems to come up here a few times, and the randomness. I don't quite understand the randomness other than, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. And Mike, and then we'll go to Peter.
I think here he's trying to say that causality rules supreme. Nothing really happens by random, even though he's saying it's random. That the importance of causality in how this order proceeds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Peter?
Well, I just want to go back to like the first sentence of chapter 5, because he's talking about contraries. I mean, he says, everyone makes contraries the original beings. And later on, he says, and everyone makes original beings in some way. Contraries is clear. Contraries are things within a genus. In Aristotle, a genus that can be split into species based on some principle. You can take animals as a genus, and if you count feet, number of feet something has, and then there's the 2-footed, the 4-footed, the 6-footed, 8-footed, and the many-footed, or something like that. That's those are all contraries. Either you're 2-footed or you're 4-footed, but you're not both. And so contraries are the original, is a source of this beings. So when you start talking about your question, when you get to, does everything come to by chance, from any chance? That's why he's talking about, can the white and the non-white, color, if color is your genus, white and non-white and gray and all those are all contraries within colors. But educated and uneducated are basically unrelated to colors. But the educated and the uneducated, or the 5th grade education, the high school education, those are all contraries within the realm of education. So you can become educated from being uneducated, but you can't become educated from being white, because that's going across that sort of genus. So within a genus, you can explain how something comes from something else in that genus or in that set of contraries, but not, there's no like creation ex nihilo out of something just on its own or across these contraries or genuses.
So before we go to Brent, just a follow-up question, and maybe this was in the reading, maybe it was not, but where would those even come from, though? I mean, I feel like that was a question in the first section between the one and the many, that even coming up with the genus of education, it's not coming,
Well,
if it's not coming out of ex nihilo, where is it coming from?
Right.
well, he's talking about motion, and ultimately he's going to just say that motion is going to be, there's some underlying thing, subject or whatever, that changes its state from one contrary to the other. So Socrates as an underlying subject can go from uneducated to educated.
Yeah, I understand that, but it's got to come from somewhere to begin with.
Yeah,
Well, he's not, he's taking it, I think, it's just given that there are I mean, you just look
Right.
around the world, there are contraries and things like that. I don't think that's,
Mhm.
he's worried about that.
Okay, Brent?
okay, the two parts. The first is that just to comment on the text itself and then get to your question. On the text itself, first of all, white does not get transformed into non-white, and educated does not get transformed into uneducated. What happens is something white gets transformed into something non-white, and something educated gets transformed into something uneducated. So here again, we're talking about adjectives and we are talking about nouns. And it's important not to confuse the two. For instance, the sophists would play games with this, and they would say that a mouse is small in comparison to an elephant, but it is large in comparison to an ant. So then they would say that the mouse is both large and small. And they would try to confuse people with this kind of a game playing, that the mouse is both large and small. Well, it's not. You know, it's large or small in comparison to something else. To get to your question, where do these contraries come from? I think that when we talk about nouns, which is substance, and like I say, the Greek word ousia, ousia has to be the center of orient. The question you have to ask yourself when you are talking about independent things and the relationship to forms and the relationship to contraries is, what is it that we are talking about? You know, we have to decide, are we talking about quantity? Are we talking about quality? Are we talking about relation? All the different categories, you know? And so in a sense, Aristotle doesn't address it here, but in a sense, it is logos which determines what we are talking about, because logos means language in Greek. It is logos that determines what is it that we are talking about. Are we talking about adjectives here, or are we talking about nouns? And it's also possible to turn adjectives into nouns. So we can talk about the quality of white, but we can also talk about whiteness, which is a noun. So there you're changing your focus of attention. But when you're reading something like that, and when you get confused about, is this guy talking, what is he talking about? You have to ask, you just have to ask yourself that, what are we talking about here? Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah. Brent, I mean, just a quick follow-up, and maybe we'll, you know, if you want to answer now, or we'll go to the line.
Yeah.
That's kind of what my question was about his use of being, the word beings.
Right.
Because it seems like he's using it for adjectives where, I mean, some of us were part of a group that was reading through Heidegger's work.
Right.
And for him, I feel like being is a noun. And I was very confused about him first, like dissecting it into one or many. I was like, what? Like, what does that even mean? I don't understand that. And then here, when he's talking about them as qualities, as adjectives. So I don't know if you want to say something here, or we'll go to the line.
Yeah.
But that was like the big question
Yeah.
I had about this reading. What exactly he means by being.
Yeah. Can I answer that?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, so for instance, we can take a look, you know, he says someplace, he doesn't say it here in the physics, but he says it in the metaphysics, that the special sciences like chemistry, physics, biology, psychology, you know, all that stuff, anthropology, they cut off a section of being and they talk about it. This is an abstraction. They cut off a section of being because, you know, physics deals with mass and motion, whereas biology talks about life. Those are different ways of saying being. And again, we have to ask ourselves, what are we talking about? And if you were described, I mean, you can describe biology in terms of physics, but, you know, there's a great deal of confusion that can happen there if you do that. You have to ask yourself, what are we talking about? What abstraction have we made? And of course, you can use all of the categories as abstractions of the thing. So you can understand the independent thing, the ousia, in terms of color. You can in terms of understand it in terms of weight. You can understand in terms of its relationship to other things. But each time you have to decide, what is it that we are talking about? But if you are talking about color, you wouldn't say, what color is the mouse? You would say, oh, the mouse is heavy. Well, you're changing the subject there. Does that help?
Yeah, a bit. Nick.
Yeah, I'm going back to the idea of opposites or contraries. I guess I might be belaboring the point, but I do want to get some clarification from folks. On the first sentence and on chapter 5, he says everyone makes contraries the original being. So contraries are inherent in the original beings. Now he says everyone makes. So I believe that Aristotle also believes that, but I am not sure if he holds that, or is he saying everyone? Now, once he says that things are made up of contraries, then the other passage that you read, Garth, is clearer, because white and non-white, they kind of are contrary and they belong. And there's something in between as well that makes sense. And it's not random because white cannot become uneducated and so forth, but it's kind of in that realm of things are contrary within the original being. At the end of the paragraph of chapter 5, the last statement he says there, for example, the great and the small belong to reason, but the rare and the dense belong to sense perception. That then, the starting points must be contraries, is clear. Okay, that then the starting point must be contraries is clear. Somewhere in between there was a proof of that. Anyway, I guess mine is more of a question or clarification. Is this idea of why original being, what is the nature of that thing and why is it contrary, made of contraries?
Yeah. Thank you, Nick, for that question. I'll bring it up again if we don't get to some type of answer by the end of James Cook. Mike.
Very briefly, I don't think he's referring to education as whether this mouse has a PhD or not. He's using it as terms of the colloquial sense that you're drawing out this property. And again, this entire section is really trying to establish a base for causality.
Thank you, Mike. James?
Yeah, I really like this. I really like the brain trust here. I think it's working really well. The first on Nick's question, the first paragraph is pointing out the origin in contraries. It's just like all Greeks agree, even Parmenides, the giant, the one that had the cult, that everybody talks about. And then that things are in conflict, and the various what would you call it, cosmic theories of origin that Greeks talked about were about opposition and cosmic formation of things out of original contraries. Then the second sentence, the second paragraph, which you pointed out, is about change. So in other words, we can prove this through change. Things don't happen at random, and things don't turn into random results. Results aren't random. We get when we destroy white, we get something that's not a kind of like a random color, but we get something between black and white as a gray, a kind of in between. So why is that? And then there's the educated and the non-educated. You always get something educated from something uneducated. There's always kind of like a transition. So this is about change, which he calls by the word here, action. He says act. But so that's really the explanation is how can things come out of opposition into something else? They come out of opposition into something else by not being random. We can show that the result of action is always some progression from previous states to further states that that are natural to the thing we're discussing. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I mean, before Greg, just if I can interpose with just again, I mean, I have to go to the first part we read where he says that he's basically saying being can't be one. Being can't be one, but to go to the next question, it seems to point that original being has to be one. Not that original being is one and undivided or motionless, but original being seems to have to be something that can have something negated against itself. Like if original beings are in contraries, everyone makes the contraries the original beings. There has to be one that comes first. They don't come out of the womb at the same time.
Actually, Garth, if I can just correct you, the quote says, everyone makes contraries the original beings. It's plural, actually.
Yeah, but I'm
Original-
saying, I'm going back to say that what he said before seems impossible. I don't know how you can argue against it being one, because one of those contraries needed to come in order for another contrary to happen. Greg?
The burden of answering where did the contraries come from, it's the burden of the pre-Socratics. He's still this early on arguing against the pre-Socratics. So it says Parmenides makes hot and cold, original beings, Democritus makes the full and the void, and they have to answer where did those come from. And the only answer would be they come from being. And then that means you have three things already. You have the contraries and being, because the contraries had to come from being. If they didn't come from being, then they, let's say hypothetically, the two contraries were the original being, then Parmenides loses because there's two things. But I think the burden is they can't answer where the contraries come from, because then they're caught in a trap. If they come from being, then being is more than one, or the two contraries are identical with being, but it's someone else's burden, not Aristotle. So it's kind of good that it makes no sense, because that means those pre-Socratics who divide everything into two, but somehow still want to say being is one, are the ones who are not making sense, that you need ultimately at least three.
Yeah, that comes in later, the third. Thank you, Greg. Peter?
So I just want to go back again that on the original beings, being is said in many ways. I mean, that almost everything is said in many ways according to Aristotle, but being is said in many ways. If you want to talk about being as such, being qua being, that is the study of the metaphysics. And so some of these questions are about that. But I think with Brent, who already said that all these other sciences, physics is a particular science. It's not being as such that we're studying. We're studying a particular chunk or slice out of being. What is the nature of, what about things with nature, and nature has to do with motion. And so the being of motion is what's understudied here. So it's not like original beings qua original metaphysical being. That's not what he's talking about here. And if you go to like the bottom of page 37, that's the last few words there, it says, so all things, and on to 38, so all things that come into being by nature either are opposites or are derived from opposites. So motion, the nature of opposites and the contrary is essential to understanding the being of motion. And that's where the contraries come in, the hot and the cold. Those are the things that are going to strife and friendship. And he gives a whole bunch of different examples like that. It's that tension, it's from opposites. You can't have motion unless you have some sort of opposition in a sense. Motion is going to be some one underlying thing goes from changes from one contrary to another. Like I think it was Brent saying the adjectives, the noun, the underlying subject is going to change from white to non-white. And that's a kind of motion. And that's what he's studying here.
Thank you, Peter. James?
I wanted to say that the answer to your question is at the end of chapter 2, where he says, not the last paragraph, but the one before the last paragraph, where he says, where he talks about the good and the not so good, and then and this would be like a human being and a horse, but their account would not be about the being one of all things. In other words, whenever we talk about things, right, we have to be talking about at least two things if we're in contrast. And but it wouldn't be about all this talking about being would not be about the being one of all things, but about the being, it would end up being about the being nothing of all things, because all these things would become the same. So that's kind of his point. And then he gets rid of chapters 3 and 4 because those are the chapters that are used by detractors to say that the ideas of the Milesian school are the same as Aristotle's. So Aristotle's science is junk science. In fact, so this guy, this translator puts them in the appendix because they're not Aristotle's ideas, but his reporting.
Thank you, James. Brent?
Yeah, I like what Peter had to say, the differentiation between the physics and the metaphysics. The metaphysics is the study of motion, but, speaking in Heidegger's terms, the physics is about the being of beings, whereas metaphysics, as Aristotle says himself, is about on, hey, on, being as being. So the physics is about being as beings, or the being of beings, whereas the metaphysics is about the being of being. And there again, you have to differentiate what you're talking about. You, Garth, talked about, sometimes it appears like Aristotle is talking about being as a noun and at other time as a verb. And that is a good question. It depends on what you are talking about. The substance, which is what beings are made up of, beings or ousia, can be not only differentiated in terms of nouns and adjectives being forms like the categories, but substance can also be differentiated into the two questions of what and how. What is the individual thisness of an object that we are touching, the individual thisness, this here, this there, of a object that we are talking about, of a substance we are talking about. Whereas how, the how of substance is a verb. So the how can be articulated in terms of the categories, in terms of potentiality and actuality, which speaks about motion and action. It can be articulated in terms of the accidental, and it can also be interpreted in terms of truth or unfoldedness, like aletheia. So here again, we were talking about what and how versus noun and adjective. I hope it didn't confuse anybody.
No, thank you, Brent. Allison.
I was thinking a lot about what Peter said, and I was thinking about the very bottom of page 37 when it says, for everything, for necessarily everything concordant comes into being from what is discordant, and the discordant from what is concordant, and the concordant is transformed by destruction into the discordant. And this is not any random one, but one that is opposite. And that's really interesting in terms of color theory, because in color theory, the two colors that go well together are the ones that are on the exact opposite side of the color wheel. If you go to one a few over, they don't work well together. And the same thing, if you're balancing, balances are achieved by pushing down and pushing up. And it's that using the energy in two different directions that makes something strong. So I really just like that one part of it.
Thank you, Allison. Yeah, good. I like all those comments. It's really good. I'm gonna jump to chapter 6, page 39. Middle of the paragraph there. Yeah, that part's good too. But this one. It is similar with any of the other oppositions, whatever. For friendship does not bring strife together or make anything out of it, nor strife out of it, but both act on some other third thing. And some assume even more things, out of which they construct the nature of things. But on top of these things, one might produce this further impasse if someone were not to set down some nature different from the contraries, since of no thing do we see the contraries constitute what it is. But the starting point should not be predicated of any underlying thing, for it would be a source of the source. For the underlying thing is a source and seems to be prior to that which is predicated of it. Further, we say that one independent thing is not contrary to another independent thing, for then how could an independent thing be derived from what are not independent things? Or how could something that is not an independent thing be prior to an independent thing? Therefore, if one were to regard as being true both the earlier argument and this one, it is necessary, if one is going to preserve them both, to set down some third thing, as those assert who say that the whole is some one nature, such as water or fire or something between these. But the in-between seems better, for fire and earth and air and water are already entangled with oppositions. Okay, there's a few things in here I'd love some clarity about. This part in the beginning, both act on some other third thing. I think Greg or someone brought up the fact that there needs to be this third thing. And this is the in-between from before. I don't clearly understand okay, Peter's saying it's not the in-between. I really don't understand what this third thing is. And then the underlying thing is another topic that's broached here. So yeah, I guess any clarity about, the third thing, the underlying thing, and the in-between would be much appreciated. So Peter, you got your hand up, go for it.
Well, I think the in-between is like a contrary is not just hot and cold. There's tepid and lukewarm and slightly frigid, those are, I think, the in-betweens between the contraries. So that's, I think, a relatively simple thing. A contrary does not just mean diametrically opposites. There can be a whole range of things. Colors, green is not the opposite of blue. There are a lot of different colors: green, purple, yellow, chartreuse, periwinkle, whatever. So there's like kind of saying those are all the in-betweens, and maybe the extremes, black and white, and all the colors are the in-betweens of that. But so that just has to do with what contraries are. But this is a crucial part, is that, remember, we're trying to find out how many starting points there are for this thing. Parmenides, those guys said there's just one, there's being, and you can't talk about anything else, and they can't get anywhere. You just really can't speak about anything from that. But then, in the beginning of chapter 5, said, well, everyone says that there are contraries. So there are at least two things: the contraries, the hot and the cold, the dense and the rare, or whatever your fire thing. In this case, it was friendship and strife are contraries. But the problem with Parmenides was nobody can make sense of something just coming into existence out of nothing or disappearing into nothing. That doesn't make logical or sense. And so what Aristotle is saying, his innovation here is to introduce, no, there's some underlying subject that is sort of the substrate for which the contraries are like adjectives change. So when Socrates comes out of his cave in March and hangs out in the sun all summer, he comes from pale to tan. But that's because there's an underlying subject, Socrates, that supports the transition between the contraries of pale and tan, or pale and colored or whatever. So that underlying subject is that third thing that supports changing. So something has to maintain its identity through change. Otherwise, it's not a change. It's just something disappears and something new comes into being. So this underlying subject, and that's kind of hard to understand what this is. So he's going through and I think exploring that notion throughout here.
So I like that. So then the underlying thing is that upon which change happens. But the underlying thing is not being. It's the changes that happen that are being.
Well, being is said in many ways. And
I know, that's what I don't like.
The being and you remember for Socrates, for Aristotle, like examples of substances are particular things like that horse, Socrates, this man, that plant. Those are all instances of substances. There are lots of substances. They're all wandering around and they all have motions and principles of motion within them. And so that's the sort of the type of being we're studying here.
Nick?
Yeah, I think we're so on the start of where is it? Can't really tell. It's page 38 for me, but there's the paragraph that ends with moreover, there are some contraries that are more primary than others, and others that come into being from one another, such as sweet and bitter or white and black. But it is necessary that the starting point always remain what they are. It seems like there's a hierarchy of these contraries as well. But the important statement, I think, comes after that. Then they are neither one nor infinite. That is, the original things are neither one nor infinite. Is clear from these things. And since they are limited in number, not to make them two only has a certain reasonableness. Not to make them two, I take it as just the contraries, one opposite of the other. So then he comes out to thinking where with friendship, if you look at it, they're acting on something else that is more original, more underlying thing, but so that both act on some other thing, the third thing. So now he's got us into three things that are possible originals. And that's where I stop. I mean, I don't know where this is heading, but so far in his development, he's thrown out the idea of one, he's thrown out the idea of infinite things. Now we're into a limited number of three, sounding as the most reasonable. Okay, just thought I'd sum up.
And Nick, just to clarify, those things we're talking about are
original things, or original beings, I believe.
Well, the starting points, the two
starting original. Are they original beings, or are they attributes of original being of an original?
The starting points.
And what are the starting points? Are they beings or
the science? Well, the three things would be the two contraries and the underlying subject. I think those are the three starting points.
okay. Let's go to Mike, and then we'll go to David.
If we're discussing, for example, black and white, and if there's a contradiction between black and white, you need a third category that resolves that contradiction. And that's kind of implied here that there are no contradictions, so you need to have that third category. It's just like when we're talking about any situation, they say you should consider both sides of every issue, but you really need to consider all sides of every issue, not just both sides of every issue. And so I think he's looking for that third thing that resolves the contradiction and gets to further definition. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. David?
I had a question on the start of this chapter, chapter 6. I'm just going to assume his premise about we can't have one because the contraries are not one, even though personally I could probably quibble. But his point about infinite, because what is infinite would not be knowable, does that seem weak to anyone else? I mean, why is infinity unknowable? And can't we imagine an infinite variety of shades of color, for example? You could still know color, even though it would be infinite. So this is something I'm not following. Maybe someone could help.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, because the imagination is, I mean, part of the imagination's job is to do things that we can't physically, right? Brent.
Yeah, yeah. So in the contradiction, if that is a contradiction between black and white, what resolves the contradiction is there must be something that is black or something that is white or something that is in between the two. So if it's gray, it is in between black and white. So it's not so much that the gray resolves the contradiction between black and white, but it is the something that is gray that resolves the contradiction between black and white. And if it migrates, if it changes color in the same kind of scenario, it migrates toward what is white, or it migrates to white, or it migrates to black. It remains the same thing. It remains something that is gray. Another time it's a little bit more white, and another time it's a little bit more gray, but it is still something. And that is the third thing. Aristotle does not come out and talk about what the being of substance is. He doesn't give a definition of substance in terms of its being. But he does say in metaphysics that, his exact words are, the question which is raised of old and is raised now and must always be raised anew, and is ever the subject of perplexity and wonder. What is being is precisely the question, what is an independent thing? What is ousia? What is substance? So in Western thinking, it is what is the being of the independent thing? What is the being of substance? In contrast to Eastern philosophy, where being is the all or the everything. That is not Western. It is Aristotle. What is the thing that determines the history of Western thinking? Okay, that's all.
Okay, thank you, Brent. I think then, I mean, I still am very much curious about things can change, but what if something, and maybe I'm racializing this, but like, if obviously people aren't black, but if someone, and people aren't white either, but say that, I don't know what I would use because everything can be kind of put into question. But what if the thing you were saying, the underlying thing is what the thing is? So at what point would you, because say, for example, that a thing cannot be black, go to white, or tan, or anything in between. Say something is, I am X or I am Y, and that is part of the underlying thing, then does that, I don't, what does that do to this idea of three? Is it simply like, well, we can't apply, because there are some things that seem to be, and it could be, 2,000 years of Western philosophy dumped in our heads, that it seems to be something can be one thing. It can be an opposite too, a man in some sense biologically in origin is a man biologically in origin, but that man who's biologically in origin, it can also now be a female. So how does that idea of the three work in this context where, and I'm not talking just gender things, because that's modern. I'm talking about in specific, like, where does that idea of three like break down?
Well, the underlying thing in the analogy that you gave, the underlying thing is not man, is not the man, is not the woman. The underlying thing is the person. So so it's not that the underlying thing has changed. The underlying thing has not changed. The underlying thing is still the person that he was at birth. He might be a different sexual identity now, but he is the same person that he was when he was born. And he might not define himself the same way, but he is the same. Does that help?
Yeah. Nick?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to go back to David's question because I think it's a good one. And I don't have an answer, but I do want to clarify, I think, a few things based on the paragraph that he brought us to. When I think the statement, they cannot be one because contraries are not one nor infinite, because what is would not be knowable, applies to the one as well as to the infinite, I believe. Not knowable, not just to the infinite, but to both of them. But he doesn't say why that is, but he does say that when he talks about Empedocles in the next section, maybe I'm not sure where to read. Well, maybe I'll read the whole thing. They cannot be one because contraries are not one nor infinite, because what is would not be knowable. In addition to which there is one kind of oppositeness in any one genus. And thinkhood is one particular genus. Plus the fact that it is possible that things are derived from a finite number of sources, and it's better to trace them to a finite number, as Empedocles does, than to an infinite number. So Empedocles traces them to a finite number than an infinite number, and it's better to think of it in finite rather than infinite. That's one of the reasons he gives. Then he adds, for he thinks he has accounted for everything every bit as much as Anaxagoras does from the infinitely many. So everything is accountable from the finite number based on Empedocles' thinking, so that it's not necessary to go to Anaxagoras' positing of an infinite number. That's the closest I can get to an explanation for why we stick with finite, but it may not satisfy.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go to Joseph, but just quick comment, Nick. I wonder if it just might be because this is about physics. I don't think Aristotle is interested in something that cannot be examined in nature, like the one. I think that's why he throws it away like almost immediately, because it can't be examined in nature.
That would also make sense, yeah.
Yeah.
We're doing empirical stuff here.
Yeah. Joseph?
I think that's kind of the answer that I was kind of going for, is that it can't be examined.
Sorry to cut you off there.
Oh, did you?
No, whenever I spoke before you.
Yeah, no, I think that's the answer that you're saying about the that it can't be examined, and the way I was thinking about it is terms of it can't be both infinity and finite, right? So there's if it's rooted in nature, there has to be a certain something that's finite, right? I mean, does that make sense in the way I'm thinking about that? That there has to be a way, like they both can't coexist, infinity and finite, if it's rooted in nature. That was my only point. And I don't know if I'm thinking about that correctly. It's more of a question actually than it is an answer.
Thank you, Joseph. Let's go to James Cook.
Well, I think this is a point of contention. And he's even admitting that he comes to at the end of that chapter. He admit that he's at a kind of like at a point where he can't go on. We can't know the truth. An impasse is the language. So I think this reflects back on Anaxagoras. I think maybe the idea of infinity here relates to the idea of continuity. That things that are infinite, like numbers, real numbers, are kind of maybe they're not realized in very well and then somebody could answer this question for me. Maybe they're not really realized well in Aristotle's philosophy, but they are realized by Anaxagoras, who Aristotle wants to, at various points, I think metaphysically wants to quarrel with Anaxagoras. But Anaxagoras is the one who recognizes infinity, and in the sense that it means continuity in time and space and so on. So in number, in number. So that's all. I just wanted to bring that up. I'm not the one to answer the question for Aristotle, but I wonder if that's where he's kind of going here. Is that there's a debate about this. We're at an impasse. We don't know the answer, but there is a philosopher who points to that answer, that infinity does have to do with this difference.
Yeah. Thank you, James Cook. I see lots of thinking faces. I don't have a response to you, but it looks like Brent does. Brent?
Yeah, the young lady who spoke at the beginning and has spoken a couple of times, I believe her name is Alicia, is that correct?
Allison?
Allison, I'm sorry. Allison, okay. She made the reference that there's a lot of Newton in, or there are lots of beginnings of Newton in Aristotle, and she is quite right. One in particular where Newton says that matter, in other words, substance, or in the context that we're talking about, the third thing, can neither be created nor destroyed. That's what Newton said. Of course, so that a thing can neither come into being, cannot be created, nor can it go out of being, be destroyed. It is eternally. Something is, it might change color. It might go from educated to uneducated. It might go from white to non-white, but it can't be destroyed. It's always going to be something else. Now, of course, we know in modern physics that matter is not the underlying thing, that rather that energy is, like in Einstein's E equals mc squared. So in that situation, the third thing did not vanish. It just becomes something else that is underlying. It moves from matter to energy. And but the third thing does not cease to be. I don't know if that helps.
James, does that help?
No, I don't think it reflects back on. I don't think it reflects back on the question of continuity, but I think it's a good explanation of what Aristotle's point. But he does. I don't know if we get past the impasse.
Yeah.
Nick?
Well, I'm just kind of in awe of how early people kind of discovered the conservation of matter or energy. I mean, it's not clear from. I mean, we have that notion or in modern science, so forth, but we're going back many, many centuries, and to think that nothing is destroyed ever is an amazing thought. I mean, it's not intuitive. Anyway, I was just gonna, it's amazing for me.
Right. The composite can be destroyed, but not the underlying thing.
Yeah, that's a thought and a half there.
Yeah.
Let's go to becoming. So page 41. I'm going to read a little bit at the end of the last paragraph. The human being persists when he becomes educated and is still a human being. But the not educated or the uneducated persist neither simply nor in composition. Now that these things have been distinguished from all coming into being, there is this to be grasped. If one looks over it as we recommend, that something must always underlie the coming into being, And even though this is one in number, in form, it is not one. And by in form, I mean the same thing as in articulation.
Mhm.
For it is not the same thing to be a human being and to be uneducated. And one thing persists but another does not persist. What is not opposite persists, for the human being persists, but the not educated or uneducated does not persist, nor what is composed of both, such as the uneducated human being. That something comes from something rather than something becomes something is said in the case of what does not persist, as the educated comes from the uneducated, but not from a human being. But even in the case of things that persist, it is sometimes said that way. For we say a statue comes from bronze, not that the bronze becomes a statue. But what is from a non-persisting opposite is said in both ways, both from this comes that, and this becomes that. For both from the uneducated comes the educated, and the uneducated becomes educated. Hence, it is also thus with the composite, for it is said both that from the uneducated human being comes the educated, and that the uneducated human being becomes educated. But becoming is meant in more than one way, and of some things it is meant not that it comes into being, but that this thing becomes something else. But to come into being simply is meant only of independent things, while in the other cases it is clear that something must underlie what becomes. Lots of things here. So I'm kind of curious about this idea of form and inarticulation. Don't understand it. And if someone can kind of tease out what is going on between something coming from and something becoming something, and why the coming into being is only an independent thing, which I think we've thrown away that idea of being something, unless I'm wrong. So yeah, this idea of form and articulation, this whole structure of something comes from something rather than something becomes something, and the coming into being only for independent things. So lots of things to chew on there. Peter, go for it, and then we can go to James. Go for it, Peter.
So the very first part of this chapter 7, he has 3 example sentences that sort of get at these various ways of things. One is that the human becomes educated. The second one is the not educated becomes educated. And the third one is the not educated human becomes an educated human. And so in those cases, some things are simple. Human and educated are simple. Educated human is a composite. It's a composite of human and education. And so, and he's just saying that we say these things in many different ways. So when you say the human becomes educated, it sounds like something becomes something else. Human is also now something else, completely educated. But that's kind of like a poor analysis of that. That the not educated becomes educated. Well, it's not that the not educated itself becomes educated, because not educated and educated are contraries. But there's going to be some underlying thing. Example, a human that goes from not educated to educated. That has that continuity that is the sort of the substrate for the change to happen. Now the form thing, that's going to be a whole different question, but I decided I would just get that part out.
Okay.
We can do a form.
Yeah. Go for it, James Cook.
Yeah, I agree there. He's actually partly he's pointing to the contradiction in predication. So the human becoming educated, the uneducated becoming educated, the human becoming educated is kind of like a kind of a built-in semantic contradiction of predication. But this brings me back again to the educated that's a continuity. There's a continuity between uneducated and educated. There isn't a continuity between humans. Each human is distinct and unique. So I think that's something that he might be trying to draw our attention to. These are two different types of categories. One is a continuous category called education. Every moment of existence for a human being can be a gradation, a step along a gradation of education. But but one's identity as a human being in each case does not change when and so the contradiction here is in the style, whatever the style, semantic style of predication is. So I'm just gonna, I don't think he's just sort of playing with that, but the contradiction of change in continuity or infinity, if you will, because that's where the continuity is coming from, the infinity of education, and versus the finite number of humans in any group. Thank you.
Well said there, James. Brent?
Yeah, throughout this chapter and in many places, Aristotle will say something like, we say that, and then he'll say something like, the educated becomes the uneducated. He'll say, we say that, the educated becomes the uneducated. And the important point is what he's saying there. We say that. In other words, in colloquial speaking, in the everyday Greek language, we say that the educated become educated. But he doesn't mean that the adjective educated becomes the adjective uneducated. He means the something that is educated becomes the something that is uneducated, or vice versa. Again, we're talking about nouns and adjectives here, and it's important not to confuse the two. But when it does appear that he might be confusing the two, it's because he says, we say in the Greek language that, and there again, it's logos determines the focus that we bring in to a certain aspect or a certain problem or a certain impasse. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. Peter?
Just sort of piggyback on what Brent said, the last paragraph, page 41, it starts as becoming is meant in more than one way. And you go to the bottom of that page, but there's always something that underlies out of which the thing comes into being. So that's that underlying thing. So even though there's many different ways saying that the human becomes educated, or the not educated becomes educated, or the not educated human becomes the educated human, all those things can only be understood if there's that underlying thing that carries the change in the adjectives, as Brent was saying. And then later on page 42 says, all the things that come into being in these ways obviously come from underlying things. Everything comes into being is always composite. The underlying thing, and then the contraries from which it's slopping around between.
Right.
Yeah. The third thing is the human. The third thing is the sculptor. The third,
Right.
There's always a third thing that's kind of like left out of the statement, and he never says that the uneducated comes from the educated. I'm sorry, Brett. He never.
No,
said
I
that.
never said that he did. But no. Wait a second. He said he didn't say educated becomes uneducated. He says the educated becomes the uneducated. So he's turning those into. He's not turning. He's talking about some underlying thing, which is the.
Can you
educated.
find the line? Can you find the line where he said that? Okay. The nutted. I got 190A. Yeah, the or the non-educated becomes educated, or the non-educated human being becomes educated. Okay, so he does say it once. Yeah, you're right. But it's strange. It's strange because that's not the natural progression of things.
Right.
You have to take a lot of drugs or alcohol to get there, I think. Yeah.
Well, Greeks and wine, right? So I did want to return to articulation, which comes up at the end of this chapter. This is on page 43. This then is one starting point. Maybe I should read it. How many are the starting points of the things involved in natural coming into being? And in what way they are so many has been said. And it is clear that something must underlie the contrary, and the contraries must be two. But in another way, this is not necessary, for it would be sufficient if one of the contraries were to bring about the change by its absence and presence. And the underlying nature is knowable through analogy. For as bronze is to a statue, or wood to a bed, or the formless is before taking on its form, in relation to any of the other things that have form, so is this nature in relation to an independent thing, or a this, or a being. I'm going to underline that. This then is one starting point, though it is not one thing, nor is it at all in the same way as a this. And one starting point is the articulation that belongs to it. And further, there is what is contrary to this. It's deprivation. That these are somehow two and somehow more was said above. It was said first that only the contraries were starting points, but later that something must also underlie them, and that they must be three. But from what is being said now, it is clear what the difference between the contraries is, how the starting points stand toward one another, and what the underlying thing is. But whether the thinghood of the thing is the form or what underlies it is not yet clear. So I'm curious again, I brought up before about the articulation and form, because it comes up again here. This then is one starting point, and one starting point is the articulation that belongs to it. And further, there is what is contrary to this, it's deprivation. So what is going on here with the articulation? Because he means speaking, but I don't understand how he means it. Is he saying that when we speak something, we create this threeness where we speak something, and if I say I love potato chips, then I create a contrary between my statement, I like potato chips, I don't like potato chips, and myself? Is that where articulation and form comes in? I really don't understand how form comes in the passage I read prior to that. That something must always underlie the coming into being, and even though this is one in number, in form, it is not one. And by in form, I mean the same thing as in articulation. What is he talking about? Yeah, go for it, Brent.
Yeah, just say that, we talked about substance, which is also called ousia, and is also called the third thing, is also called thinghood, or an aspect of thinghood. But anyway, one way to look at substance, or to look at the third thing, or to look at ousia, is to understand it as that which is addressed, that which is talked about, that which is articulated, what we are focusing on at this particular moment. So if we are talking about white becomes black, or heavy becomes light, what is it that we're talking about? What thing are we talking about that is heavy and at other times light, or black and other times white? What is it? So that which is focused upon, that which is articulated, that which is addressed is the third thing. So there is that relationship between logos and and substance. Okay.
Thank you, Brent. Peter?
I'm going to take a slightly different tack there. I think he's broaching the subject, which we will get into much better, about the difference between material and form and how those go together, and lack or deprivation. Those three ideas, how those actually work together to have an account of change or motion. So he says, for as bronze is to the statue, bronze would be the material of the statue, or wood to a bed, again, wood being the material of the bed, or as the formless is before taking its form. And there we get to what is the quintessential thing about material for Aristotle, is that it has potency. It does not yet have a form applied to it. So wood in and of itself, just a pile of wood out there, has no real, it isn't really fulfilling a role. If you take that wood and make a bed out of it, now it's been informed, literally put into a form of a bed. So you have the form, and the material is just the sort of like pure potency in a sense. The ability to become something. Now, not every wood doesn't have the potency to become, the rocket ship, let's say, or something like that. There are limits within each material's, potential potencies. So I think that is what this nature is. And so if you think about material is lacking or is deprived of its form, it's when it takes on a new form that you get some sort of underlying motion. I think that's what he's getting at, but this is on the edge of my understanding here, so I'm a little incoherent on.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Nick?
Yeah, I'm kind of with Peter here, although less developed than him. I think just in this case, what I'm getting out of it is that, all right, we talked about the contraries to, and then the underlying object. He's saying, well, that's one way of looking at it, but it may not be the only way. It may not be the necessary way. Another way of looking at it, which is what you read about articulation, is that something has an articulation of it, of the thing, and there's a deprivation of it. Is to look at it that way, that the articulation is whatever it is, maybe, I don't know what are the good examples. And it has a certain deprivation, which turns out to be the opposite. And by looking at it just that way might be also another way of talking about it. And whether that has something to do with form and matter, probably right, but it didn't jump out at me at this point. So he's just showing another alternative, although I don't think he'll stick with that. Doesn't looks like he spent so much time talking about the contraries plus the underlying thing that I'm guessing that he's going to run with that.
I think he does in chapter 9. He starts talking more about deprivation, material, and form.
Okay.
Okay, Allison, and then James, you'll be our last comment.
I think what he's saying here is, because he's going back and forth between saying, the thing that it starts as and then it turns into something else. But when he's saying that there's something underlying that, it reminds me of, I think Michelangelo said that he didn't feel that so much that he was creating a statue as that he was freeing the statue, that the statue was already there and it was his job to just chip away everything else to let it come out. And so I think when he's talking in here about, what's underlying the thing, I think that's the sort of where he was kind of going, that sort of idea.
Thank you, Allison. I like that that Michelangelo idea. James?
Yeah, I think when I read this, I think the one word, time. In other words, the thing that's happening between applying form to bronze is time. Time needs to occur, needs to pass before it becomes a statue. Time needs to occur before wood becomes a bed. When I think about the material of the solar system being kind of a disk of dust and, hydrogen and other things, it has to coalesce over time into planets. It's the same idea, but over a much larger time scale. Whenever a human being is involved in a kind of a transformative matter, he is of transformation. He's applying skill, something which is acquired over time. We call experience, education. Experience equals skill, and then we apply that to matter, and we get things like statues and beds and so forth. So I think yeah, somebody else just said, Peter just said that in that, just responded to that. Wood in time is still a pile of wood. Wow. So, well, there's an imposition. Yeah, he's pointing out that there has to be an imposition. But what's the imposition on something in nature? In other words, the seed growing into the tree, what is being imposed? Well, there's gravity, there's water, there's earth, nutrients, and so forth that have to be imposed upon the seed. So it's not just techne, it's also nature that we're talking about. Humans are part of nature.
Okay, great.